the pricking of my thumbs. Something wicked this way comes.
This was back in the 90s. My coworker was at her best friend's house when they were about 8 or 9. They were upstairs in their friend's mother's master bedroom playing by the dresser. When you walked up the stairs, the bedroom was to the left. When you walked into the bedroom, the bed and dresser were on the right, and that's where the girls were playing. So you walked through the door. You would pass the bed and then reach the dresser. The mum had an old 80s style bed that had a mirror and lights on the headboard. The lights never worked. So they're up there playing, and they hear the friend's mother call to them to come downstairs. The second the mum calls them, the bedroom door, which was open, slams shut super hard and loud. This freaked them out, and they looked at each other, wondering what the heck just happened. Her friend, thinking it's her brother, shouts at him to stop scaring them. At that moment, the non-functioning lights on the headboard started flickering. They start screaming and are too terrified to move from their spot because they would have to pass the bed to get out of the room. They finally get the courage and run out of the room, screaming down the stairs, and the mum is all irritated, wondering why the girls are slamming doors and acting crazy. The girls tell the mum the story. And the kicker? Mum says, "I just came in from outside. I never called you." When I was in my teenage years, around 15 or 16, I had my one and only paranormal encounter. On Sundays, my parents and siblings would go to church, then stop by my grandparents for lunch. They'd usually be gone for 4 hours or more. I was a rebellious teenager at the time, so I would choose to stay home instead. So I'm laying on the living room couch, watching Dragon Ball Z clips on YouTube, when suddenly I need to go to use the bathroom. So I get up and head that way. I get to the bathroom, close the door, then proceed to sit on the toilet. I've been in the bathroom for about 5 or so minutes, still watching YouTube, when suddenly something starts knocking on the bathroom door. Now, I know it was coming from the bathroom door because, for one, it was fairly loud, and secondly, because the door shook from each knock. These knocks were about half a second apart from each other, and no knock was louder than the other. I'm not a badass now, and I definitely was not a badass back then, but for some reason, I pulled up my pants, walked over to the door, and yanked it open. Nothing was there. The knocking stopped the moment I yanked the door open. I quickly go around the house and check to see if all the doors are locked. All of the doors are locked. Then I check all of the rooms and closets to see if anyone is in the house. No one. By this point, my adrenaline is starting to wear off, and I'm beginning to get really scared. There was just this eerie vibe floating in the air. I felt like I was being watched. Don't remember much after that. My family got home a few hours later. No one believed me after I told them, of course, but I knew for a fact that I was in that house alone when the knocking occurred. I knew for a fact that the knocking stopped the instant I opened the door. There was absolutely no time for whatever it was to get away in that short amount of time. This is a story I've heard multiple times throughout my life. In 1983, when my parents first got married, about 2 years before I was born in 1985, they had an apartment in the older part of the city. It was a great little starter apartment for a young couple just getting their life together. But it wasn't long before they started noticing weird things happening. Back then, my dad was really into home and car sound systems, and in fact, installed car sound systems professionally. His work even won a few competitions back in the 1990s, but I digress. So he had a pretty nice one set up in their apartment. His stereo was always on a rock station, but at some point, he began to notice that when he would come home and turned it all on, it would be on a gospel station. Very peculiar. But then it got to a point where it would change while he was in the apartment, actively listening to his music. From that point on, weird noises started coming in the night, starting with hearing quiet voices from the empty apartment next to them. It escalated to a point where it sounded like people fighting in the apartment next door, like violent screaming. One night, between 2 and 3 a.m., they woke to what sounded like a box of dishes being flung against the adjoining wall of their bedroom. They lay there, trying to figure out what the noise was. Suddenly, there was this aggressive pounding on the wall. They said it sounded like someone was trying to pound their way through the wall. Within 2 days, they had found another place to live. They moved into a 2-bedroom house that my dad's sister owned. Thankfully, whatever was messing with them in that apartment stayed behind when they moved out. I drove past this building a couple of years ago, and they were tearing it down. It's no longer there, but that empty lot still puts off some weird vibes when you drive past it around 2 a.m. This is the story of my time living in a truly haunted house. It was the scariest, most terrifying paranormal encounter that I have ever had. To anyone who is a skeptic, I don't blame you, but I would testify in court to the events that happened in that house without blinking an eye. Before we start, I want to say that I have no history of mental illness, nor is there a history of it in my family. I rarely drink, usually only socially or wine with a good meal, and I do not do drugs. At the time I was under some stress, but isn't everyone? And any attempts for me to explain these events away have failed miserably. I am a very logical person, and no logic could ever prepare me for my time in this house. So strap in, hold on, because this is a crazy ride. I moved into said house after going through a long, drawn-out, extremely messy divorce from my abusive and controlling ex-husband. It took me 1.5 years to finally escape him, and even after our divorce, he continued to hound me, even with me living 3+ hours away from him. I loved my new job, I loved dating again, and I loved the city that I was living in. I really began to feel alive for the first time in 8 years. Just for clarification, we were married for 11, together for 15, but the last 8 was when he became extremely abusive. While I was still trying to move on and find out who I was, it was the strongest and happiest I had felt in a really long time. So those attempting to blame my divorce on any sort of mental break, it was just the opposite. I do admit that jumping back into the dating scene after 15 years of monogamy was absolutely nerve-wracking. It was also exciting, fun, and exhilarating. It was around May when my father called me out of the blue. He had fallen again, the biggest thus far, in a series of falls, and he couldn't care for himself properly in the state he was in. A few years prior to this, he had fallen and broken his back, making tasks painful and difficult to complete. Cooking, cleaning, and even bathing were problematic. And so, as he broke down on the phone with me, the phrase, "I just don't know what to do anymore," dug into my heart. My lease was up in a month, and so I made the decision to move 8 hours away so I could help care for my father. I explained my situation to my job, put in my 2 weeks, gave notice on my apartment, told the guy I was dating steadily about the move, and bought a crap ton of moving boxes. Over the next month I packed, worked, and packed some more. I started moving things down to my dad's on the weekends to make it a little easier on all our backs, and by June I was driving a U-Haul moving truck with the rest of my belongings down to South Texas. The day I moved in, I was really exhausted, mentally, physically, and even a little emotionally. I had worked really hard to get to where I was at the time of the move. I had my dream job, a comic book appraiser. I had recently gotten my apartment just how I wanted it. I had started dating a guy exclusively, and I had made some really amazing friends. It was tough leaving all that behind me to start over, but my dad's happiness was so worth it. Anyhow, after getting the essentials sorted out, bed, toiletries, charging cables, computer setup, I called it quits for the day and went to take a shower. You know how most ghost experts say that hauntings don't start immediately? That it takes time for the spirits to come out because they are shy? Yeah, that is a bunch of rubbish. That house had the most outgoing spirit in the world, and they were in no way shy of making themselves known. As I was melting under the surface of the sun temperature water, I heard what sounded like footsteps above me. Not heavy like someone stomping, but more like a child running back and forth, back and forth. I know what you were thinking. It was a critter that got into the upstairs area of the house. And this would have been my thoughts as well, except there were a few things wrong with that theory. First, I have heard cats, dogs, raccoons, squirrels, rats, mice, and even snakes in upper rooms and attic ceilings before. They each have unique sounds, and none of them sound like a child running back and forth. Secondly, there was no room, attic, or anything above my head but a roof, so I listened quietly, perplexed by the little feet sounds I knew couldn't be there. And after a while I shrugged and began soaping myself up again. Almost instantly after dismissing the noises, I was plunged into darkness. I stood there, the water beating down on me, soap held like it was going to save me, and eyes as wide as they could go just staring into the darkness. This bathroom had a single tiny window that a child would barely fit through, and being as it was dark outside, it offered no assistance in illuminating the room. I called out to my dad since he was in the room directly beside the bathroom, and also because I thought he might be pranking me somehow. See, the light switch to the bathroom was outside in the hallway, a design choice I will never understand. In my head, it was the only reasonable explanation to why the light was off. My dad was being silly on my first official night here. It wasn't really like him, but it was the only logical answer. Unfortunately, he did not respond. I called over and over, progressively getting louder, and finally I could hear shuffling and my dad's door opening. Being tired, I didn't really put anything together at the time. I was just glad when my dad's voice called out asking what I needed. I told him to please turn the light back on, and to please not turn it off again, since I didn't want to fall and kill myself in the shower. He laughed and turned it on. Then I heard him say he was going back to bed. I took his laugh as confirmation of the prank and finished up my shower. As I settled down into bed a little later, I watched the ceiling and thought about a lot of things. Eventually, I began wondering how my dad had opened and closed his door without me hearing during the time I was in the darkness. While it didn't make any sense, I chalked it up to my calling out masking the sounds of his retreat to the bedroom. Eventually, I drifted off to sleep. The next morning, I woke up, sore, tired, and dreading the rest of the unpacking process. I could smell fresh coffee and happily followed the alluring scent to the kitchen. My dad wasn't in there, so I grabbed a cup and went to sit outside with him on the front porch. This was his morning ritual, and he did it every single morning without fail. As we sat talking about asinine things, I started hearing the pitter-patter of little feet again. I was confused because we were outside, and it was so loud it sounded like they were on the awning over the porch. I asked my dad if he could hear the noise and what it was. He pointed to his next-door neighbor on the right of the house and basically told me that the mum lets the kids run around like crazy animals all day and night, that the mum never disciplines them, and they don't have a bedtime. He said that since the house wasn't underpinned, that the sound of them running around constantly echoed over to our house. The explanation sounded plausible, and I wrote it off as fact for the time being. That night, I went to sleep just as tired, sore, and mentally frazzled as anyone who has ever moved will know. It wasn't anything physical that would bother me this time, though. It was my dreams that were absolutely horrible. The most disturbing thing about this dream is that it was so vivid. It felt so very real. I was lying in bed with my eyes closed, just thinking about all the things I still needed to do, when the door began opening. The door to the room didn't creak or make any noise itself, but the room had a ceiling fan. When you would open the door, the difference in air pressure would make an audible, contrasting sound. So even if you had your back to the door, you knew when someone entered. Hearing this distinct change in air, I turned my head to the side and was terrified to see the black shadow of a person. I began gasping and tried to escape by crawling across the bed to the other side. That is when I felt hands on my ankles and the massive force of this shadow person pulling me off the bed and out of the bedroom door. I began screaming and attempting to grab onto anything I could reach, but as soon as I got a hold, the entity would rip me away from it, breaking my fingernails and forcing me towards the front door. As they dragged me closer to the door, the front door had a large oval window in it. I could see my dad sitting on the front porch smoking a cigarette, oblivious to my screams or the situation unfolding. Instead of taking me outside, the thing turned and started pulling me back into the house. I woke up screaming, sweating and flailing my body around, trying to get away. I heard my dad run down the hall and bust into my room a few seconds later, holding his pistol. He thought someone had broken in and was murdering me. It was so real, I actually thought someone was in the house and had attacked me. I grabbed my pistol and we began sweeping the house for an intruder. It wasn't until we were 3 rooms down that I began to really think about what was going on and explained that I thought it may have just been a dream, even though it seemed so real. I asked my dad if he had been on the porch smoking, and he said he had about 10 minutes before I started yelling, but he had already come back in and was getting ready to go back to sleep. He then gave me a hug and walked me back to the bedroom, but still went and finished sweeping the house after I laid back down. I had this dream almost every night for a month, and it only stopped when Agador, not his real name, moved in with us. Agador was my steady boyfriend from before I moved, and he decided to join my father and I down south after being away from me for a couple of weeks. For some reason, however, when he arrived, the dreams never came back. Not that I'm complaining. To replace the dreams, however, a lot of other things began happening. I had partially unpacked boxes lining the hallway that led to the bathroom, and we would hear what sounded like someone rifling through them. I thought maybe it was just mice or rats, even though there was no proof of any pests. But eventually, hearing the actual boxes moving disproved the rodent theory. Items would just disappear into the thin air. One minute, the remote to my TV would be sitting on the bedside table, having just changed the channel or adjusted the volume. The next, poof. I would look everywhere for it. Under the bed, strip the bed of all covers, look for it under all the other furniture in the room with flashlights. Nothing. We would go to bed and I would wake up to find it right where I'd left it. This happened to many things. Car keys, wallets, important papers, my brush, even clothes. The footsteps continued but got much worse. The bedroom butted up against a stairwell that led to the upstairs area of the house, which had its own door that you had to open to walk up the stairs. The door would constantly come open on its own, even if no one touched the handle to open it. This became so bad that we had to put a thumb latch on the outside of the door to stop it from opening. It took it about a month before even the thumb latch didn't stop it from gliding open. But back to the footsteps. Whenever we're in our room, it didn't matter the time of day or night. We could hear someone open the door and walk up the stairs. This would start the activity, but it would slowly progress to non-stop noise. It is kind of hard to blame it on the next door neighbor's kids when you can actually hear someone directly behind your head walking up the steps one by one. Then we would hear them walk back down the steps, stop directly behind where our heads were at, then rock back and forth, making the stairs creak slightly as they did this. It felt like someone was standing above us, just staring down at whatever we were doing. Then instead of hearing them go up or down, the running back and forth would start up again, like they had teleported to the bedroom upstairs. It was so unnerving. I explained the theory of next door neighbor's kids to Agador, and he dismissed it outright, saying there was no way it was that loud, directly above us or behind our heads, and of course, he was sure the neighborhood kids weren't coming into the house and unlatching the little lock on the door. This would also happen when we knew the neighbors were out of town, so no kids to make the noise next door. We would check multiple times on the noises, but there was never anyone or anything there when we did. One day, we had relatives coming down for a holiday, and I was upstairs trying to put together beds. I didn't mind being in the room upstairs. There was no heavy aura or anything like that, so I was going about my business trying to make sleeping space for everyone. We had quite a few kiddos coming, so I was putting together a set of bunk beds for them. I leaned everything up against a wall, where you would have to lift it up and pull it forward for frames or mattresses to topple over. If they did stand any chance of falling, it would be for the bottom to slide out and it to glide to the ground. This is not what happened. I'd put one of the frames together and had already gotten a mattress from the stack of mattresses next to the frames. As I cleared the unused frames, not touching them, I pushed the mattress onto the bed I had just put together. When I heard the sound of clanking, I turned around just in time to see the frames lift off the wall and crash directly down onto my right foot. This is the point in which I mentioned that I had broken that exact foot twice within the past year. Now, it would be 3 times. Yes, the frame just happened to land exactly where I'd broken my foot twice before, and this time it shattered it. I had to go to the hospital and be put in a big, ugly boot and all. Up until this point, I was still skeptical about everything, even if Agador was 100% convinced it was something paranormal, and was also sure it was attached to me specifically. But watching those bed frames lift up with nothing there to shift them, and then push them forward, that scared the hell out of me. What was very peculiar was that after I got hurt, all the activity stopped completely for a really long time. I'd say about 6 months worth of silence. No running, no missing objects, no rustling of unpacked boxes, just nothing. Going from all this happened constantly to nothing happening at all, it was a bit unnerving. Agador posited the theory that the entity didn't really mean to hurt me, just scare me, and it felt bad that I got so severely injured. Slowly, towards that 6-month mark, things began to become missing again. Then all the old activity launched into a second campaign of craziness. I am a huge nerd. I am probably one of the nerdiest people you will ever meet. I like both Star Wars and Star Trek. I collect comic books and storybooks. I have a library of both. The sci-fi fantasy genre of literature, movies and TV is my favorite, and I have an entire wall of movies to prove it. I also love anime and regularly cosplay as either an anime toon or my favorite sci-fi or fantasy character. I love playing games, be it cards, board, video, console or PC, and tabletop games. My house is filled with action figures, plushies, art from these genres, and costume pieces from my cosplays. I'm a huge Renrat, LARPer, and Historical Society player. Half of my closet is nothing but Ren Fair, LARP, cosplay and historical garb. Why is this relevant? Well, whatever this entity was, I'll give my guess later on. They loved playing with my action figures and plushies. I would constantly find my action figures toppled over, turned in different directions or missing. We would find them in other rooms, usually upstairs, and they would be set as if a child had gotten cold for dinner and just left them abandoned. I have this one original Ewok plushie from 1984 that I have had since I was a child, and it absolutely loved that thing. I kept it up on the top shelf of my action figure shrines, since it is very old and kids loved trying to grab for it when they would go into my room. The Ewok would either be missing, usually found upstairs on its side, even though it had its own special stand, or we would witness it being pushed off the shelf to fall down onto the floor. Now, the stand wouldn't be with it, just the doll, which is, well, physically impossible. The fan was not strong enough to cause this. There were only floor air conditioning vents in the room, and there was nothing that could have pushed it off. It would just make a flying leap off the top shelf randomly. TVs would turn off or on by themselves all the time. Not just mine, but also the one in the living room. This happened with multiple witnesses on numerous occasions. Once, my father and I were sitting watching TV in the living room, and a cardboard tube for posters or documents was sitting on the couch opposite us. Randomly, it lifted up like it was sitting on the couch, not laying down anymore. Then it was flung forward off the couch towards us. As soon as it launched itself towards my dad and I, the TV turned off. Also, if we were zoning out watching a movie, the pots and pans on our pot rack would begin lightly banging against each other in the kitchen behind us. Digital clocks would also constantly be wiped of their times, and the really crazy thing about it was, they didn't all go out at the same time. If it were something with the electrical or a power outage, all of the clocks would reset. Instead, it would reset my alarm clock or the microwave clock or the coffee maker and leave the rest alone. It was absolutely bizarre and frustrating. Not just the bathroom light would be turned off while someone was in there either, but it was the most frequently messed with light switch in the house. The amount of electric-based appliances and items that suddenly failed in that house was insane. I had just purchased a new computer prior to moving to my dad's house. While there, my NIC went out twice. My power supply, numerous fans, and eventually the hard drive bricked. It wasn't just mine either. Both my dad's computer and Agador's had components that just started failing out of the blue. My Xbox 360 died to the red ring of death, and my Blu-ray player would only play very specific movies. All of these items were plugged into surge protectors, and some of them were still under the 1-year warranty. It was like the house was a place where electronics came to die. Towards the end of my stay with my dad, my brother decided to move in instead of me being there. The activity got so much worse. As soon as there was any discussion of me moving away, the entity went absolutely nuts with activity. Everything ramped up, and Agador thought that it was mad that I was deciding to move away. Remember, this is taking place in the deep south of Texas, down by the Mexico border. It is extremely hot and ridiculously humid all the time. To combat this, my father put foil to cover all the windows, to help reflect the heat out away from the house. It actually worked really well, but it meant you couldn't see out of the bedroom windows. One night we were asleep, and I kept seeing these flashes of lights through my eyelids. I'm a super light sleeper, so it began waking me up, but not enough for me to open my eyes. I just figured there was a lightning storm outside, and rolled over so my back was facing the window. Since I was slightly awake, my brain was listening for any thunder to follow, but none ever came. Slowly, my thoughts began putting two and two together, and I sat straight up in bed. There was no way I would be able to see lightning, with foil blocking my windows. I looked over towards my desk, that was in front of the windows, and I saw that my desk lamp was flicking on and off. It wasn't being turned on and off, but it was like the bulb in a flashlight with fading batteries. It would be bright, then flicker to dim, then off, then bright again, then off, then to dim. It was freaking me the hell out, so I woke up Agador and pointed to the lamp. It did one cycle of its weird dance and then turn on, full bright light, and stayed on. We did not turn this on. We did not leave this on. It was doing this on its own. To top it all off, the only way it would turn on was a knob at the back of the lamp that you had to turn, not a button or a switch to flip. It scared us both. Agador got up and unplugged it completely. Another crazy electronic incident happened while I was in the kitchen making dinner and my dad and Agador were sitting watching TV in the living room. I kept hearing a weird noise back towards the bedrooms, and after about 5 minutes, I couldn't stand it anymore, so I went to see what it was. The boys heard me, and Agador decided to go with me to see what was making such a ruckus down the hall. As we got closer, I recognized the sound. It was my printer. I'm not sure if you have ever cleaned the heads of your printer, but it makes some very distinct sounds when you do. These are the noises we kept hearing. As we went into my room, the noises didn't stop. It just kept going off like someone had chose to clean the heads over and over. Agador went up and pushed the cancel button. Nothing happened. He pushed and held down the off button. nothing happened. Finally, he was like, screw it, I'll just unplug it. He got down and crawled under the desk to my power supply, and then hurriedly got out. Grabbing my arm, he began pulling me out of the room and closed the door behind us. I was confused and kept asking, what? What's wrong? What happened? Agador was white as a sheet and said, the printer wasn't even plugged in, remember? I realized he was right. Since so many electronics kept failing, if they weren't something we used all the time, we would keep them unplugged until we needed them. We slept on the couch that night. It wouldn't be the last time I slept on that couch either. One morning I was woken up by the sound of the door opening. That distinctive noise shifting the air around me. I heard Agador walk around the bed. Then I heard the bed creak as I felt him get into bed with me. The covers shifting with his tugs. I figured he just had to go to the bathroom and was coming back to sleep. I glanced up at the clock, since I knew it wouldn't be long before I had to get up for work, and froze. Agador had to get up at 5 a.m. every morning, and would be gone by 5:20 a.m. It was almost 6 a.m. at this point. I would have just assumed he had slept in, except my sleepy brain began remembering that he had already kissed me goodbye and left. I had no idea what or who was in bed with me, but it wasn't my partner. So I grabbed my phone off the nightstand, rolled forward off the bed, and went straight out the door without ever looking behind me. I say I slept on the couch that morning, but there was no sleeping going on, I assure you. Another time I was sitting at my computer playing WoW, and I heard the same door noise. I had a basset hound named Blue at this time, so I figured it was just him coming into my room, since Agador was at work. My dad always knocked before coming in, so I ruled him out too. I called out to Blue, patting my leg and beckoning him to come get some good ear scratches, when I heard him, behind me, laying down on his doggy bed. He had never gotten up and left, which meant he hadn't entered the room either. Looking back towards the door, I saw it slowly closing, as if someone had come in and was letting the door shut from its own weight. There was no one in the room, and I asked my father if he'd come in later on, and he said he was taking a nap at the time. In the months leading up to us moving out, there would be many more times of something crawling into bed with me, or just getting into bed while I was sitting at my desk. The door would open and close whenever, and the stairwell door began slamming if there was no attention paid to it rummaging around in my room. I had started going back to Austin area to look at apartments for Agador and I to move into, and he said that all the activity would completely stop when I was gone. From the moment I would drive off, nothing out of the ordinary would happen. He was terrified that when we left, since it was so attached to me, that it would still follow us. I have to admit, I was scared of this too. The biggest fright was yet to come, however, and a week before we were moving out, I was given the biggest scare of my life. All evening the spirit had been super active, running up and down the stairs and above our heads. It opened the stairwell door, then slammed it, then ran up and down again. I can't explain how terrifying this is. When you know it isn't your family members, it's not an intruder, and it's something you can't even see when you check on it. We just turned the television up louder and tried to focus on the movie. It was at a lull in the movie where the scene was quiet when we heard the entity walk slowly down the stairs and stand directly behind our heads again. It did the signature swaying back and forth, making the 2 steps it was standing on groan and creak under its weight. We listened to this for a few seconds before, bam! It sounded like it had punched the wall behind us, directly behind our heads. We felt the wall shudder as it shook our headboard. We both jumped up out of bed and I ran and hid behind the footboard. Agador just stood on the front of the bed with his hands balled into fists, ready to fight whatever came at us. It was horrifying. My dad came down the hall a few minutes later and asked us if we were okay. We explained what happened, and he gave a little grunt, then sighed, shrugged, and went back to bed. There really was nothing we could do about it. Eventually, Agador calmed me down enough to go back to watching the movie, and we fell asleep an hour later. Well, he did at least. What happened next literally scarred me for life. As I previously mentioned, I'm a light sleeper. A feather could fall on a pillow down the hall, and I would wake up. It took me hours to finally fall asleep after everything that had happened earlier, but I did eventually fall asleep. I have no idea what time I woke up, but I can tell you why I woke up. I heard the sound of the door opening. Now, I couldn't remember hearing Agador going out to go to the bathroom, nor did I hear Blue scratch the door open and go out. We usually never fully close the door so Blue could push the door open with his paw if he needed to get something to drink or eat. Confused by this, I rubbed my eyes and opened them to see who had come in. There, standing directly beside my bed, was a short, black figure, much like the shadowy figure from my dreams when I first moved into the house, just smaller. I screamed, grabbed the remote to the overhead light and ceiling fan, and quite literally crab-walked backwards over Agador to get away from it. My finger kept mashing the hell out of the light button, but nothing was happening. Looking down from the entity to the remote for only a second, I made sure I hit the right button, and light flooded the room. There was nothing there, nobody in the room. I yelled that someone was in the house, that someone was standing right there. My body trembled so hard, my teeth were actually chattering, and I felt nauseous. Agador grabbed the shotgun from beside the bed and began clearing the house. I wanted to do the same, but I was shaking so hard that I could not stand. I could barely speak at that point. My dad joined the search, and they found all the doors and windows locked and no one inside the house. My dad said I just had a bad dream again, but I was adamant that this was no dream. After my father went back to bed, I sat in our bed next to Agador and just shook and cried. I knew it was not a dream. I reacted immediately, never took my eyes off the figure until I looked down at the remote, and I knew it certainly wasn't sleep paralysis. To this day, I know what I saw. I can still feel the fear. I can still hear the terror in my screams. And I remember how badly I was shaking from the experience. The entity didn't come at me, didn't speak, didn't even move. It just stood there, staring at me from my bedside. It was like a child coming in to wake up their parents because they want a glass of water. I'd say the size of a child that is 7 or 8. Not big, but also not tiny. It was pure black, like the complete absence of light, but humanoid shaped. For months after this, I did have actual nightmares of this encounter. I would wake up in a cold sweat or crying out from fear. I think that is the other reason why I know this was not a dream, because I had dreamt of it, and the reaction to the dream was much different than my reactions that night. When I woke up, I knew I had been dreaming. I felt the sleep releasing my body and mind. While I was still scared, I was not terrified like I was in that initial moment. We moved out a few days later, and I have only gone back to that house a couple of times since for holidays. Luckily, my father no longer lives there, and I have no reason to ever go back. As for what I think it was, I believe it was the spirit of a child. It latched onto me because I was the only mother figure in the household. It loved playing with my toys and electronics. It played around upstairs, which was probably its room from when it was alive. It was mischievous, hiding things, turning off lights and electronics to play with us. And it stopped playing its pranks when I got hurt. I do think it got mad when it found out I was leaving, throwing a fit that I would go without it. And maybe appearing beside me was its last attempt at trying to get me to stay somehow. Maybe like it was saying, "See, I'm just a child. Don't go." Despite what I think it may have been, it terrorized me for over a year with nightmares, sounds, and its pranks. And I'm just grateful that it did not follow me when I left. Hello watchers and listeners, thank you so much for watching. A huge thank you to all the subscribers who took their time and effort to write out stories for me to read for this one. I still have a few more stories and some more on their way, so expect another subscriber story special in the next month or so. So if you personally have any stories, feel free to send them to me anytime. I'd like to make this a regular thing. If you'd like to help support this channel, there are links to both my Patreon and my Teespring account in the description below. Feel free to check them out. And a huge thank you to those who already do support me on Patreon. And as always, the biggest thank you to all of you who continue to support me. And remember,
Papa loves you.